do you think that there are certain technologies that can be useful in helping us alleviate or maybe probably eliminate this nuisance of smog?
I believe so, right? So when we look at smog, right, it's a combination of CO2 emissions and other environmental components. The reason Pakistan really stands out is because the amount of CO2 that is concentrated in the air is much higher than the UK. I fundamentally believe direct air capture has a place here in Pakistan.
Pakistan contributes less than 1% to the global emissions, but it faces a lot of consequences, ironically and surprisingly. So what role can international community play in this regard?
From a British thermal unit perspective, coal does emit the most fossil fuels, so it's the easiest target to say we need to get rid of this. Pakistani government will have to put some kind of incentives to draw investor confidence to say not only will these projects make sense by themselves as self-alone projects, but they'll also have padding with additional layers of incentives.
What is Energy Basket, and what makes it so practical and pragmatic, specifically in the developing parts of the world?
The Energy Basket is a way to look at the world of energies, and it's a beautiful world. Can I change the world? There's 8 billion people. It's impossible. But can I change the world around me and those around me? I can try my best. And so we need to have that discussion. We need to be able to, again, awareness, education, and then we go from rhetoric
to reality,
to actionable steps that create the reality we want to deliver on.
Most of the people do not really understand this very intimate connection, I would say, between energy usage and dependency of so many lives of people.
Sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Hello and welcome everyone to another episode of the WTI Talks. Today is a very special episode. We're going to talk everything about energy and low carbon and energy technology. And everyone, we all are aware, or we actually suffer from the consequences of the current energy crisis happening in the country. And to talk about it and to enlighten us further, we have invited a very special guest, a dear friend and a mentor. He has arrived in Pakistan all the way from Houston, Texas, USA, Mr. Fernando Hernandez. He is the chairman for the Board of Society for Low Carbon Technology and also the business ambassador to Scotland, as appointed by the longest serving First Minister. Thank you so much, Mr. Hernandez, for being with us today. So
My pleasure.
Let's talk about energy. My first question is coal. So coming from the western part of the world, coal is being looked, in a not a very good light these days. And specifically, there's a lot of pressure on countries like Pakistan and the developing world overall to wean itself off from coal. But you and I both know that it isn't very practical. What are your thoughts on the future of coal as an energy resource for countries like Pakistan?
No, that's an excellent question. So, albeit I am coming from the Western Hemisphere, I was raised in a developing nation by way of Mexico. So that does give me the key distinction of understanding that there is a view from the developed world and the developing world. But we have to bridge that, right? That's imperative. Now, to the core of your question with respect to coal from a British thermal unit perspective is the most polluting fossil fuel that exists, gas being the least. With that being said, Pakistan does have the imperative, just like every other nation has that imperative, to ensure that they have the energy for their local populace. Just experiencing my time here and in other regions of the world, we experienced load shedding. My heater went out last night, kind of woke up with a cold. But that's not special to me. That's occurring across the nation. So therefore, this does impact humanity in many ways, and people feel it and leave it. But it has to be believed that for the transition to occur, there's going to be different pathways and transitions. And every nation has that sovereign right. Now then, can we be more judicious and prudent with energy? We can. But at the same time, we have to ensure that the local population is protected. That is the imperative, that is the message, and that is and will continue to be the focus.
Okay, and it's also very interesting to see when we talk about coal and the developing part, but recently, despite all the rhetoric surrounding energy transitions and all of these things, and I often have these discussions with you as well, we still see that Germany or many economies of the advanced world, they're still using coal as a resource. So can you please talk about that? Why is it so difficult for countries to just let go of the fossil fuels?
Yeah, well, one of the things, as we know, with the Paris Agreement of 2015, Conference of the Parties 21, we just had COP 28, there's a lot of rhetoric, right, on all parts of the world, on both sides of the aisle, developed and developing nations. Again, from a British thermal unit perspective, coal does emit the most fossil fuels. So it's the easiest target to say we need to get rid of this. But then that's the rhetoric. When we see the reality, whether it's Germany, whether it's Pakistan, or the et ceteras, the reality remains baseload is imperative. You need it for electricity and other key resources. So when you have your population, and we all know this when elections come up, if people are paying very high prices for their electricity, the likelihood of someone being elected once more diminishes, right? And we're already seeing this with the Dutch TTF by way of, well, that's a natural gas index that serves a very key role. Natural gas is spiking once more. And that's creating a lot of upward pressure because of that demand. And as a function of that, the cost of electricity is going higher. Whereas with coal, that can be controlled much better. So we also have to remember, yes, we are talking about energy, but we have to remember the economics of the energy and how it affects the population and those governments that are currently in office. But again, that doesn't mean we should be dissuaded from pursuing a low carbon future where coal is at some point not phased out, but phased down. But it has to be done in a tempered way that protects human life.
That protects human life. And what is really interesting is that most of the people, many, do not really understand this very intimate connection, I would say, between energy usage and dependency of so many lives of people. That's what we call about the political economy of energy. And this this is a good segue to go into the second part of the discussion about energy basket. I've been reading your work about this, and I'm really moved by the idea, that I'm already embraced that ideology. So can you please tell us, the listeners, that what is energy basket and what makes it so practical and pragmatic, specifically in the developing parts of the world?
Absolutely. It's very, again, I am going to use the word imperative because if a hospital where there's infants being born, if there's not enough electricity and you do have a backup generator and that runs out of fuel, what happens to that human life?
Yeah.
I mean, we know the obvious answer.
Yeah.
That being said, the energy basket is a way to look at the world of energies, and it's a beautiful world. We have the three primary energies, which are coal, oil, and natural gas, and we have emerging new energies by way of hydrogen, geothermal, and the et ceteras there, which go on in a very pronounced way. But all that is to say, if we look at the energy basket at its core, you have the conventional energies, and then you have, again, renewables, hydrogen, and what's part of that aisle. So rather than saying it's us versus them, it shouldn't be that way. It's how do we find a gray area in a Venn diagram of energies and saying, let's make the best of our energy. And that's determined by three components. It's determined by topography, geology, and weather patterns, not climate. Weather is the here and the now. Climate is more macro. So that is a very key juncture. It's less divisive rhetoric and say, hey, Pakistan, or hey, Argentina, how can we find the best available energy resources without being divisive? Because if we're divided on that premise, then we will never find a way, and never is a strong word, but it should be used, because if we don't find a way to co-create and collaborate, then we will continue down the path of rhetoric.
Okay. And I would really want to, can you give us an example of how this idea of energy basket would work out in the real world? I mean, does it need to have a specific grid? What will be the energy resources that we will be using? And once again, just relating it to the Pakistan, the country that we are right now in, I mean, Pakistan, and how does it stand to maybe resolve our crisis?
Sure. I'd love to dive into that. You know, you can always have, renewables at your availability. One thing that I think Pakistan can favor from is geothermal technologies.
Okay.
And so what geothermal does is it gives you a lot of baseload resilience. And it is a form of clean technology. That's not to say you shouldn't use coal. Mm-hmm. But again, you're looking at the topography and the geology. If the geology tells you by the premise of the energy basket that there is availability to geothermal, one should tap into that. If another region has access to hydroelectricity, you should tap into that. So again, it's a way to look at, so when we look at topography, there's also bathymetry in which rivers fall into that. And so by really assessing your landscape, you can start to tap into all the different forms of energy. At some point, you can start to find a tempered way or a balanced way where the energy mix of that basket becomes less CO2 intensive, so it becomes more low carbon.
Okay.
But again, in that example, there is hydropower here, right?
Yes.
What isn't here yet, and perhaps one day it will be geothermal and other forms of cleaner technologies. So again, it's not going to say, coal is bad, hydro's good. No, it's all of the above, but let's look at a tempered way to go low carbon. So again, if there is a hospital and there is load shedding, we can ensure those infants have a chance to live.
Okay, that makes sense. And talking about technologies, my next question is that you have observed and you have traveled in other countries of South Asia and Southeast Asia as well, where we see this problem of smog, right, which is prevalent. What do you think? Do you think as a technologist, because I know that you're really passionate about technology, you're yourself an award-winning, technologist. So do you think that there are certain technologies that can be useful in helping us alleviate or maybe probably eliminate this nuisance of smog?
I believe so, right? So when we look at smog, right, it's a combination of CO2 emissions and other environmental components. But having said that, I fundamentally believe direct air capture has a place here in Pakistan. I'll repeat that again. Fundamentally has a place in Pakistan. Why is that? As you were as kind as to mention, I am an award-winning mentor with the Net Zero Technology Center. One of the companies that came out of the Net Zero Technology Center is Mission Zero Technologies. Okay. I'm still in contact with their CEO, who I know personally. But what am I getting at and what am I referring to? Mission Zero Technologies was the first UK company to launch direct air capture. So for those who may not know, direct air capture is, in a very brief way, is a way of taking in what's in the atmosphere. Okay. You can look at it as just a vacuum cleaner of sorts. Okay. So it's bringing in what's in the atmosphere, and then you're creating CO2 output. And we'll get to the output component here in a bit. But the reason Pakistan really stands out is because the amount of CO2 that is concentrated in the air is much higher than the UK. Okay. Right? You go into the UK, you can see the blue skies. Right? Even on a quasi-rainy day, you can see the blue skies. Here this morning on my drive and to come here and all the other drives, you don't see the blue skies. I've seen this in Bangladesh, I've seen this in Nepal, and in other regions. So again, the concentration of CO2 lends itself better for direct air capture, is my personal belief, than it does in a place where, that type of smog, which when it reaches a higher intensity, is referred to as smoke. Okay. Right? Yeah. So by having that, I do believe it'll help the populace. And then the CO2 that you're able to utilize from direct air capture goes into, this is water, but if it had Coca-Cola requires CO2. Okay. Fire extinguisher, so if there's an emergency here today, a lot of fire extinguishers require CO2, and so do many industries. So it does have a practical use. We just have to look at how we view CO2.
Right.
because it's required.
Okay, so I really want you to just tell us, because many would not be aware of these
Sure.
technologies and how it works. So, first of all, how does a concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere helps in this for the said technology to be useful? And how does this technology actually works? Can you give us an example? Like, if we install a system, what would it be? What would it look like?
Absolutely. There's referenceable projects. The Orca project that is operating in Iceland.
Okay.
It's been a great success. I would encourage everyone that's listening to this. They have an amazing YouTube video that can give you visuals of what this direct air capture facility looks like. Now, the difference that they have and their approach is that they're putting it in a geological formation.
Okay.
So they're putting back into Mother Earth the CO2.
Okay.
Right? So on one hand, when you emit CO2 by way of coal, oil, or natural gas, the byproduct is CO2. So that CO2 goes into the atmosphere.
Okay.
The direct air capture facility is able to absorb that CO2.
All right.
And once it's processed, you can inject it back into Earth.
Right.
So proverbially, you're taking the CO2, which is the cousin, the long lost cousin of coal, oil, or natural gas, and you're putting it back into Mother Earth, right?
Okay.
So that's one way of sequestering it, and that would be permanent sequestration, the way Iceland is doing it. Now, the UK project that I just mentioned by Mission Zero Technologies, their view is actually quite different. And I won't get too nerdy because you know me. I'll get into.
I know.
I'll get too excited with technology and things, which I always do. But having said that, they're going to use the CO2 for sustainable aviation fuel. We know that the aviation industry is an emitter that is impacting this biosphere. And there's measures that are being taken. So having said that, the CO2 can be used with hydrogen. You have to do some molecular conversions with the CO2. But all that is to say is that with hydrogen and CO2 that's converted into carbon monoxide, you can produce sustainable aviation fuel. You can also produce naphtha and renewable diesel, or we can just call it sustainable diesel. And all of this is by taking the CO2 that's already in the air. So rather than taking more fossil fuels that are beneath the surface, you're able to take from what's above the surface.
Wow. So you're saying not only this technology, direct air capture, not only it will help us to reduce the amount of emissions in the atmosphere, but it can also be used, of what I'm trying to understand is in the establishment of a new economy sort of thing.
Absolutely.
Like it is a byproduct for so many other things.
Exactly. And that's the part of it, right? That's the impetus is that, yes, it's technology, but it's also economic growth.
Yes.
It's also the existing generation and moreover, the younger generation that can have these very high-skilled jobs, very high-skilled talents in these emerging economies. Because now with sustainable aviation fuels, for example, you're creating derivatives in a much different and eloquent way is my belief. And then if they're learning about direct air capture and then how to produce green hydrogen with electrolyzers, I mean, this requires a highly skilled force where this talent, the world needs it.
Okay.
So if a nation like Pakistan were to strike out and take that first mover advantage, others are doing it, but it's not at a large scale. It's not like the fossil fuel industry that is, goes on for, it has a lengthy track record.
Yeah.
Here, we're talking about a very nascent technology. So there's no reason why Pakistan could not become an emerging leader. And by that logic, lead to economic growth, could even impact positive GDP growth. But above all, give the youth a chance to be highly skilled.
I mean, it can open up a whole job market as well. So
Absolutely.
That is brilliant. So, Mr. Hernandez, keeping in this theme of technology and its use, I would really like you to shed some light for me and for the audience, for the listeners, that how the story of US is very interesting. How US has been able to become the largest producer of oil and gas. And I'm sure the role of technology is critical in this regard. For a country like Pakistan, where many different estimates forecast that in about the next 20 years, we will be done with our oil and gas reserves, I believe it is imperative for us to look for ways to enhance our oil and gas production. How can technology help us in that regard?
Absolutely. So necessity is the mother of invention.
Yes.
Necessity.
Yeah.
So we look at the American story. In 2014, fourth quarter, the OPEC's 166th meeting occurred. That created the first, what we could call the war against the frackers in the United States. Fracking is a form of technology of how you're able to go into a hole and then go lateral and you frack.
Okay.
And that really kicked off the shale revolution, or the U.S. becoming what it would become. But that wasn't good enough, because with necessity came more innovation. And what do I mean by that? When the price of oil dropped very, very low, and the data's there, it knocked a lot of companies into bankruptcy or off the market altogether. So it required more resilience. It required efficiencies. It required improvement in technologies. So again, the way you go out and frack has changed. The way you gather knowledge of what's beneath the surface, the geology, you have, great advancements in 4D seismic. So that just lets you know what's going on beneath Mother Earth.
Okay.
And by having that more inherent knowledge, you're able to make more data-driven decisions that give you a higher yield. And so that correlation is evidenced by the fact that the rig count in the United States has dropped, right? But the production has increased.
Right.
So one would think, well, you need more rig counts to produce more oil. The U.S. is doing what is a staple of efficiency, and that is doing more with less. But this started in 2014 when that upward trajectory was being seen by Saudi Arabia and others within OPEC. And then, again, the market crashed, so the U.S. had to become more efficient. Coming to Pakistan, there will have to be a time of reckoning where that necessity kicks in.
Okay.
And perhaps it's already there, perhaps it's on the cusp of being there, but ultimately, the technologies exist.
Okay.
It's just a way of leveraging these technologies that are on the private market. So what we see in the U.S., that's not owned by the government. That's owned by the private markets. So it's a way to find ethical and unique business models to transfer technologies and not necessarily make investments. You could call them purchases, but you would also have to acquire some of that knowledge base and be able to bring it to Pakistan. But this has been done before.
Okay.
Scotland became what it became with the Forties field, which was one of the most shattering fields in terms of what it did to the UK economy in the 1970s. And that required Texans going to Scotland. Now Scotland sends its technologies to the Americas. So that has been seen in the Middle East as well. Now it's, when does Pakistan get that necessity to say, we need to tap into, technologies from abroad, expertise from abroad, to be able to produce more? Because the time of efficiency is here. It's now. And that's evidence, again, I can't emphasize it enough. The rig count has dropped, but the production has gone up. Okay. That is the hallmark of efficiency.
Okay, so I would really want to talk about the challenges surrounding these things. But before that, speaking of efficiency, it reminds me of the role of transport sector that it plays in the carbon emissions and related topics. So do you think the internal combustion engine, the ICE engine as it is known, and you've seen a lot of cars here, the rickshaws, and it is one of the biggest contributor to the CO2 in Pakistan as per the recent studies as well. What do you think is the alternative to that? I mean, is there any way we can make it more efficient? Is there any way we can reduce the emission from ICE? Because I do not think, and please let me know about your thoughts on this as well, that we can just replace all the ICE vehicles with electric vehicles, at least for the next 20, 30 years, specifically in countries like Pakistan. So what should we do to make our transport sector more efficient?
Excellent question. And I'll start off with what I've seen in Qatar.
Okay.
I'm just coming back from Qatar as well. And Qatar produces its electricity by natural gas. They're tapping into the best of their resources, which speaks to the energy basket. And by that logic, over 98% of their electricity is produced by natural gas.
98%.
Over 98%.
Okay.
So when I was at a charging station right there in Doha, that electric vehicle is an emission elsewhere vehicle. It's not solving the dilemma of emissions. Instead, at the point of where the gas becomes electrified at a plant, the CO2 emissions are happening there.
Okay.
The charging station, you can have someone in a Tesla, for example, because of the staple of electric vehicles, and they may be under the impression that they're not causing any emissions, but the reality is they are. Because the electricity that's in the grid, ultimately, that's driven by fossil fuels will tell you how clean that vehicle is.
Okay.
So to that point, there's a lot of coal electricity here and from other sources. So until that becomes green, these electric vehicles will just be emission elsewhere vehicles. So I think that's very key to touch on, because if Pakistan starts to make investments in electric vehicles and that grid hasn't been greenwashed, because we know it's not green at this juncture, if it's not green ready, these investments, and Teslas are not inexpensive vehicles, right?
Yeah.
They're quite costly. So we have to look at that part. Now then, to the question of what can be done with vehicles. Again, when I was talking about sustainable fuels, you can create diesel from CO2. You can also create sustainable aviation fuel. So if you do have direct air capture and green hydrogen, you can have a way to decarbonize these vehicles and also defossilize. So we use the term decarbonize, but defossilize is to get away from fossil fuels. Again, every nation has their own sovereign right to that path. So if we look at a recent flight, and why this is not science fiction, but it is science fact. A recent flight from London Heathrow to the US just crossed the Atlantic with sustainable aviation fuel that was not derived from fossil fuels.
Okay.
So why can't Pakistan do the same with its vehicles?
Okay.
But again, there needs to be the impetus of these emerging technologies, developing the workforce. And as you can see, there's a natural balance that starts to emerge by protecting the biosphere, enhancing the local communities, and having both of those components coalesce into a unified structure that benefits all. Not just the biosphere, but also the next generation, the youth. They need job opportunities. Everyone needs a fair handshake at opportunities.
Certainly.
And I'll quickly say from what we saw in Mexico, or as we would say in Español, Mexico, is we would have El Día de No Circular, which means the day of not circulating. So I relate this to fossil fuel fasting. On certain days, you weren't allowed to drive your vehicle.
Okay.
Now, generationally, we're taught you drive as you want. But the reality is, does it have to be that way? Who taught us to think that way? Right? People fast for different reasons, whether it's religious or self-disciplinary or health reasons. Why can't people go on a fossil fuel diet and say, like I saw in the 80s in Mexico, this car is not going to circulate? So that was a fossil fuel diet. It was a way of fasting. So we as people can make those decisions to say, we're not going to drive that vehicle today. Or the government can work with the populace to find an even balance. And now to some, this may sound like a very grandiose idea, but we lived it.
Okay.
And my sister has very severe asthma. So for me, it felt that there was something in our control that we could do to lessen emissions and help the environment. So hopefully that answered your question.
It does. But I mean, I don't see why this won't be a practical step that can be taken. You know, just fossil fuel diet, love the term as well. Speaking of all of these prospects about how technology can help us resolve these pressing issues, I would also like to listen or, hear that what's the other side of the picture. So
Sure.
What sort of challenges you think that we or any certain country from the global south or developing part of the world would face in this endeavor to, I don't know, implement direct air capture or sustainable aviation fuel, or things like that? What sort of challenges are we looking at?
I always frame challenges as opportunities,
Okay.
right? The
Right.
challenge is the opportunity, and that's where the excitement comes from as a technologist. Because we have this light, we're going to air this maybe on YouTube.
Yeah.
So I will go back to one of my favorite quotes. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So we have to remember that these things sound grandiose, but they have to be grandiose. And the way Pakistan can start to do this is by educating its younger generation or existing generation and creating awareness. Because if there's no awareness, then how does this become a talking point in universities or, here with the World Times International Organization? So first, it starts with education. It starts with awareness. It starts with people realizing, wait, I can impact change. I can be part of this growing nascent economy. This can help my future. It can help the biosphere. So we have to start somewhere. And that somewhere is here, unequivocally. So that's one of the reasons I will say I am in Pakistan is, can I change the world? There's 8 billion people. It's impossible. But can I change the world around me and those around me? I can try my best. And so we need to have that discussion. We need to be able to, again, awareness, education. And then we go from rhetoric
To reality.
to actionable steps that create the reality we want to deliver on. But where's the pathway? I would ask rhetorically, doesn't have to be answered, where's the Pakistani government pathway for decarbonization, for green hydrogen, and for direct air capture? So if that framework doesn't exist, that's okay. That challenges our opportunity to work with government or other entities to assist, because we're in it together.
Yeah.
We have to co-create and collaborate.
Perfect. Like very well said. Finally, all of this, as you just mentioned, is a collaborative effort, right? In that regard, what role or what significance has the international community to play with? Because, I mean, we all know about the asymmetrical relation between carbon emissions. Like 2 countries in the world are responsible for about 45% of the carbon emissions. Pakistan contributes less than 1% to the global emissions, but it faces a lot of consequences, ironically and surprisingly. So what role can international community play in this regard, beyond the rhetoric of COP28 and COP29?
Sure. It is very, the symmetry is not there. It definitely is lost. One of the things that we saw after the oil embargo in the U.S. was that the miles per gallon that were required in vehicles became more stringent. So you had to do more with less, efficiency, right? Just like we saw in the U.S. with fracking, you had to do more with less, more miles. So that can be measures such as, how do you increase or enforce? Because that's what happened in the U.S. We do it in Pakistan and say, this car shall travel this many miles per gallon or kilometers per gallon. Yearly, this car has to be inspected. And if it's not passing its inspections and is showing that, at the tailpipe, it's not good for service, then it needs to be decommissioned or be brought up to spec so that it can continue to be in service. So there's these small steps that can be taken that when you compound them, the aggregate does contribute to change.
Okay.
And, that can also mean phasing out older vehicles. But there has to be an incentive. So if you do see older vehicles on the road, a nation could say, okay, we'll trade in this vehicle and XYZ amount will be provided towards a newer vehicle that does meet higher mile per gallon or kilometers per gallon and has a higher efficiency rating. But now then, that's the mobility point and perspective. But what we're seeing is just south of here, right? We have coal plants. So there has to be a way to harness that coal as well. And there is a way to harness CO2 from coal. You can use carbon capture storage to put the CO2 back into Mother Earth, or use that CO2 for other purposes. So again, we have to look at mobility, but we also have to look at the emissions that come out of coal plants, for example, or even natural gas plants, because, Pakistan is dependent on natural gas
Yes.
from external resources. But again, at that point of conversion, you're going to have the cousin of these fossil fuels, which is CO2, which you can inject back into Earth. So again, you have to look at mobility, but again, you don't have to inject. You can also use the U. So I should have said this, but I'll say it now. You have carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So you can use the CO2 for, again, like I said, for Diet Coke if we had it in here, or you can store it underneath the earth as the United States has been doing on a geological level, Canada as well, and Brazil is on the cusp of doing it. So we have to look at it holistically. Vehicles are one part, but we have to look at emissions from these facilities that process, route, or in some way lead to emissions from fossil fuels. So I hope that answered your question.
That does. And finally, this is the final question, final one. In terms of funding, because for countries like Pakistan, the biggest hindrance or hiatus in pursuance of these technologies or implementation of these ideas would be the paucity of money. So just if it is not at all task was, just as a ballpark idea, how much it is required, let's say, to install a DAC DAC, direct air capture facility? Does it run into millions of dollars, or what would be the estimated cost that we're looking at?
Yeah, well, it depends on how much CO2 you're trying to capture.
Okay.
Right? So that scale, the more you try to capture, the higher the cost goes. But yes, we are talking in the millions, especially as you go higher and higher and higher.
Okay.
But again, it needs to happen. Direct air capture is still a very nascent technology, but so were the airplanes.
At some point.
They didn't exist 2,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago.
Yeah.
When you look at archaeological findings, you will not find an airplane.
Yeah.
Full stop. That doesn't mean it shouldn't happen. So why shouldn't direct air capture have proverbial wings installed so that it can become what it needs to be?
Yeah.
Or at least have a fair opportunity.
Yeah.
So from a funding mechanism, you will require the private sector and the public sector and the government sector coming together and working in the most harmonious way possible to make these projects a reality. We've seen the Watershed Inflation Reduction Act. We call it, or some call it, the IRA or the IRA. So the IRA has unrivaled incentives. So the Pakistani government will have to put some kind of incentives to draw investor confidence to say, not only will these projects make sense by themselves as self-alone projects, but they'll also have padding with additional layers of incentives. So one can be a CO2 incentive. We call it 45Q in the US, 45V for hydrogen, 45Z for sustainable aviation fuels. But it's looking at how that layering looks. I won't get into the nuances. You can't stack all these credits, but all that is to say is it increases, and I'm involved in projects where it makes the projects, as when you look at it from an investment standpoint from the private markets, it needs to be bankable. So the bankability of that project increases when you have government incentives that you can couple with self-standing incentives or self-standing revenue, better said, by the private markets, whereby what's created, if it's green hydrogen or the CO2 that's outputted, that is a commodity. CO2 is moved globally. It's used every day. Hydrogen is used every day. It's used for ammonia, known as NH3, hydrogen being the H2. I'll stop getting nerdy.
Yeah.
But again, hopefully that goes to the core of your question, but happy to expand further.
No, that I think it explains. But without the incentive, especially for the business community or the investors, I think this makes it practical. This makes it workable because it's a win-win for everyone involved. No, Mr. Hernandez, this was, we can go on about for another hour or so, but I think we have gotten what we needed. I personally learned a lot from this one, and I believe the listeners would have as well. And once again, thank you so much for being with us today, and hope to see you next year once again and welcoming you here.
The pleasure was all mine, and thank you for having me.
Not at all. Thank you.